Well, let's get rolling. Again, welcome to the Native American Language Resource Center Summer Series on how to create an immersion school. Today's session is titled Thinking Through Your Options, Finding the Right Fit. This is our second live webinar in a series that will be running through the summer. Before we get started, let's go ahead and get disclaimed. Oh, shucks. All right, I guess I'll read it. So the disclaimer is this presentation was produced under the U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises Incorporated. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. Now that we've gotten disclaimed, I would love to introduce ourselves. Aloha, I'm Olani Lily, and joining is Casey Morgan. We will be your facilitators today. Hi, Casey.
Hello, Osio everyone. Thank you for joining.
Let's get started.
Okay, so our agenda for today will begin by doing just a brief overview of the summer series, kind of letting you know where you're at in the sessions and what we have coming up. Then we're going to talk about a continuum of language immersion types for you to kind of think about what might be the best fit for your program or the school that you're designing or running. And then we're going to talk about some existing organizational structures that you might consider as far as school models for your school. And then at the end, we will do a quick little breakout room networking, answer any questions you have, and preview what's next. So by the end of today's session, you should understand the types of immersion programs and school models, including the pros and cons of each, and be able to identify the type of immersion program and school model that would be the best fit for the school that you want to develop. So when thinking about best fit, be sure to consider the goals of your program, available resources, and potentially existing schools and programs that might be in your communities. All right, so once again, welcome back to our summer series. We thank you for attending session 2. So just to kind of recap what the summer series is about and what we have left. So within the summer series, there will be live webinars like this one. So there will be 3 more after this. Then we have podcasts, blog posts, and tools that go along with the topics as well. And at the end of today's session, we will share the link in case you need it to find the podcast, blogs, and tools and where those are being housed. Okay, so these are the series of webinars. So remember, this is session 2, so that's where we're at. And then next Thursday, we will have session 3 on curriculum and teacher training with a subject matter expert from Montana. And then after that, we will move to session 4, where we'll talk about language proficiency and assessment, and we'll highlight multiple examples in that session. And then we will wrap up with native language revitalization and technology. And then stay tuned for some exciting things that we are developing around school operations as well. So we look forward to seeing you at those future events. Like I said, we're going to start off with language immersion types. I do want to give the caveat that there are many different ways that people might use some of the terms that you'll hear in this session, this part of today's session. There might be many different kind of definitions around different communities. So we will go through how we are defining things for the purposes of this session. So just a heads up on that. All right, so We are going to start here with this continuum. So this is a continuum of the language immersion types that we will specifically explore today. You may have also heard of language programs that are considered elective programs, which would be closer to like a traditional foreign language class setup. We did leave that off here because we are going to focus in on particularly immersion programs. A few notes on the continuum that you see here before we dive in. So first, like I said, we want to acknowledge that there are several different definitions, uses of these terms, and models across different immersion communities. So I'm going to start by kind of defining these things and norming around them for today's session. So first, we have partial immersion. For today's session in this series, we are defining partial immersion as a full or nearly full immersion program that tapers off in later grades to include English or to increase the amount of instructional time spent in English. Olani, you can go back to the.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good.
Mhm.
So we will have a poll for you guys in just a second. So I want to make sure you have the full continuum up there. Lost my train of thought, sorry. So a full or nearly full immersion program that then tapers off in later grades to either include English or increase the amount of instructional time spent in English. We will look at a couple specific breakdowns of that time that you can consider. And then the second language immersion type that we will explore is dual language. For today's session and this series, we are defining dual language as a consistent 50-50 or similar model that services both non-native and native speakers of the target or immersion language. And then finally, we have full immersion. So for today's session in this series, we're defining full immersion as one that delivers 100% of instruction in the immersion language. So all contents in the target or immersion language. And so while some full immersion programs may have optional kind of bridge components in later grades, their general instructional program is consistently a 100% model. And then as you kind of see that arc is created by the immersion types organized in terms of student proficiency. So you may have kind of seen some of these things talked about in an order of percentage of time spent in the language, but we organize this by student proficiency outcomes that come from language and literacy research. So as you can see, students completing a full immersion program have the highest proficiency and fluency rates in the target language of immersion. And then dual language would be kind of the second closest, and we'll talk more about that later. So to begin, we are going to pull up a poll, and we just kind of want to get an idea of right now where your thoughts are around these. So which immersion type are you most interested in or kind of leaning towards at the moment? And then we'll dive into some examples of each of these. Thank you all for your participation. Okay, just a couple more seconds to give everyone a chance to respond. Okay, so it seems like the most interest is around partial immersion and then kind of equal amounts of interest there between dual language and full immersion. Great. And we will revisit that. So just be reflecting as we're talking about this about what might be the best fit for your particular program or community. And then we're going to kind of come back to this idea as well. Okay, so to reiterate, partial immersion is a full or nearly full immersion program that tapers off in later grades to include English or increase the amount of instructional time spent in English. So though the school does not fully instruct in the immersion language dominates instruction in most existing programs, particularly in Indigenous language programs, especially in the foundational literacy grade levels. So partial immersion can be a good fit when most or all attending students do not have a foundational understanding of the immersion language or are not exposed to fluent speakers in their homes. Because in this model, you really get that full exposure in those foundational literacy levels, particularly because research has found that starting to learn a new language before age 10 gives the learner the best chance at achieving native speaker proficiency. Even though subsequent research has shown that children remain adept learners until 17 or 18 around language, but that sweet spot really is that foundational literacy piece. So this might be particularly helpful in communities where maybe you don't have a lot of native speakers that are in homes with your student body. And then for students already frequently exposed to English, a higher concentration of study in the immersion language in earlier grades may be ideal for those reasons. Students in a partial immersion model do exhibit higher rates of proficiency in the immersion language as compared to students taking traditional foreign language classes or elective programming. And so we'll go through a couple different examples of what a partial immersion program might look like. Okay, so if you look at this, we're looking at instructional time by language. So the blue is the target language or the language of immersion. And then that darker red color would be English. And so most existing Indigenous examples of partial immersion programming use a model similar to what you see on the screen. So a lot of those programs teach exclusively in the language of immersion from K through 2, which is that foundational literacy period. And you can see in this example, they introduce English in 3rd grade and then stay with that same level throughout. We will look at a couple other models where the English increases over time. We will also look at an example where the English is introduced in 5th grade. So there's lots of different options and pros and cons to when and how much you kind of introduce. This type of model where you have that exclusive immersion instruction in those foundational literacy grades right there is what's called a sequential literacy model. And so that helps students develop literacy in the target language, in this case, the Indigenous language, before moving on to formally developing literacy in English. And so, like I said, in this example, the English is introduced in the 3rd grade and remains a part of instructional delivery through the upper grades. In this specific case, that 20%, so the red bar that you see represents 20% of instructional time for those 3 grade levels. And so in that case, that 20% essentially represents students learning language arts in English or taking an English class in English for the duration of grades 3 through 5, while the remaining content, so your science, social studies, would still be taught in the target or immersion language. Other models, and this model that we're about to go over, this 90-10 model, is really common in Spanish, English immersion programs. And so while, like I said, while full immersion start is common in partial immersion programs where the immersion language is an Indigenous language, there are other models that could be applied to your program that you can kind of take from how people have structured immersion programs around the country. So another example of a partial immersion breakdown is this 90-10 model. In this type of a breakdown, students in kindergarten spend 90% of their instructional time in the target or immersion language and 10% in English. So it's starts out as nearly full, but not quite. And then instructional time in English then increases by 10% each year. And this type of structure also develops student literacy sequentially. Not quite as much as that first example we saw, but it definitely always has some of that English instruction, but is more heavily immersion in the first few years. And we'll see an image of kind of what that would look like on the next slide. So those of you that are visual like me, this is a visual representation of what that might look like. So as you can see, the blue decreases and the red increases over time until you reach 4th grade, where it then becomes 50-50, like maybe a dual language model would be. There's lots of different ways to do this. In some programs, you might continue to increase the amount of English as you increase grade levels. On this visual, you can see that once it hits 50-50, it then kind of transitions into this dual language type of model, which is also an option as well. So you can really, within partial, you have lots of different options for how you might structure that instructional time. And we are going to share with you an example of a partial immersion model, and I will let Olani kind of give you some information about the model and talk through some pros and cons of when English is introduced in this model.
Sure. So this is, if you were at the last live session, we had a leader from a parent group of Waiau Elementary School speaking. This is actually the school which our child had gone to. It is a school within a school. So it is an immersion school located on an English speaking language campus. It is a K-6 school. Instruction is 100% in Hawaiian in the lower levels. And then there's that model that Casey was talking about where English is then introduced in the 5th grade. I know some of the challenges around really playing with the idea about when best to introduce English and how to introduce English, because a lot of the feedback from parents and students is that they feel sort of behind as it relates to English, particularly if maybe in the 6th grade they transfer to another school that is exclusively in English. And so there's been a lot of thought and discussion regarding the introduction of English. But one of the pros of this model is that, you know, it is a school within a school. And so the principal, all of the services and the operations of the immersion school are housed under the umbrella of the English speaking school. Also, there are already like facilities that were already built. And so this school did not have to go out and locate facilities. This is one of the first 2 school within a school, what we call a kulakaiapuni within the state of Hawaii. This was the first one, and then there was another one in Keaukaha, again, another school within a school model. And so that's sort of the pros. On the con side, there is a little bit of, because you're under the structure of the English school, the priorities and resources go to the larger population. And so you are really sort of vying for resources within that school, and also trying to be able to create some independence as well, again, because you are under the structure of that school.
Thank you, Olani.
Yeah.
So the next one that we'll talk about was that one that was in the middle there on the arc. And so that would be the dual language. So dual language, some people also refer to it as bilingual, has similarities to partial immersion. So instruction is taught in both languages, like in a partial immersion program. However, we would contend that dual language programs are consistent 50-50 splits. And then how you split up those minutes is, again, where you have some options where there's lots of different examples of how people structure their instructional time within that. So daily instructional minutes or weekly instructional minutes are typically split between the languages, and dual programs tend to have more language diversity between students who are native and non-native speakers of the immersion language. So if you do have a mix of students, there are lots of structures around like student working groups that are really helpful for growth in the immersion language if you do have that diversity of native language. And so those mixed working groups can enhance the transmission of both languages. So in the instance that you have some students who do have native fluency in the native language or have exposure to the native language at home, and then you have students that have minimal exposure and mostly are exposed to English, then having like mixed working groups in a dual language type of program can enhance transmission of both of those languages between the students. And in a well-established two-way program, research shows that students exhibit language proficiency levels most similar to full immersion. And so this is an example of a dual language program. And so it's a UPIC immersion program. College Gate Elementary is a public school that is part of the Anchorage School District in Alaska. And the program started with a kindergarten class and then has grown a grade level each year since. As you're thinking about creating programs, designing schools, that might be something you want to consider as well, is how you want to build out the program. It's really common for new schools to start off with that one grade level and then continue to add, which can help with resources and sustainability and things like that. And they do have a feeder pre-K program that is also an immersion school. The feeder school is Cook Inlet Tribal Council UPIC preschool program. But any student can apply for the immersion program, this immersion program, through a free lottery-based system. And when we do post the slides in the video, in the slides, you'll see for these examples that there are links for you to go explore the website. And then in this case, there's a really awesome video that talks about the language pipeline that they've created for UPIC. And so you can watch that as well. So there will be some resources for you to continue to explore some of these examples. In CollegeGate's case, they split instruction 50-50 between UPIC and English Daily. So you would start in the morning, either in an English class or a UPIC class, and then you would switch halfway through the day. And so their split is not only done by daily instructional time, but across content as well. And we will look at different types of splits in more detail in just a moment. And so in their case, social studies and science are taught in UPIC, and then language arts and math are taught in English. And we're going to watch a brief video that kind of gives an overview of this program.
Casey, I think you're going to have to share the audio.
Russian, German, and Mandarin Chinese. However, in a state with over 20 official indigenous languages, having an Alaska Native language immersion program has been long overdue until now. In the fall of 2018, CollegeGate Elementary opened its doors to the Anchorage School District's first Alaska Native language immersion program, welcoming close to 30 kindergartners who would soon be learning in both English and in UPIC. Dr. Martha Bigelow, professor of second language education at the University of Minnesota, had this to say about the program.
I am so thoroughly impressed with Anchorage Public Schools for taking the bold move to create an immersion program in UPIC, a Native Alaskan language. They're joining a worldwide initiative to revitalize Indigenous languages. And I think it's very apropos that 2019 is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And this is the culmination of the first kindergarten that has gone through the first urban Indigenous language immersion program in the US that we know of. I think that Anchorage School District is launching this program in the very best way possible. They have chosen a program model that is what we call a 50-50 model, where the children are half day in only UPIC and then half day in English. And this guarantees their language development in UPIC as well as English, their language and literacy development, as well as all of the content areas that they need to learn. And this UPIC program really is part of a bigger global initiative that is very grassroots, but also very international in terms of the spirit of it revitalizing, supporting, and nurturing Indigenous languages.
Okay, so like I said, there are several different ways that you can achieve or create this 50-50 split. So here are some examples of some dual language instructional splits. So as seen with the example, some programs create that 50-50 split each day based on contents. And so in this type of split, specific contents would be taught in one language, while the remaining contents are taught in the other language. But a 50-50 model can also be implemented by splitting instructional minutes each day. Many schools that split instructional minutes like that, so that split it in a daily way, will spend time in each language daily across the content. So for instance, if you have a 90-minute literacy block for elementary school students, then you would spend 45 minutes of your literacy block in English and 45 minutes of your literacy block in the immersion language. And then if you're in a situation where the school spends only 45 to 50 minutes in subjects like science or social studies, I know in some cases, particularly in some public elementaries, there are 90-minute math and literacy blocks, and then you have 45 or 50 minutes for science or social studies. So in that case, then you might alternate days for those contents, but split instructional minutes for the longer blocks. And then you have the splitting by days of the week. So that's if you've seen a dual language or bilingual program where they have like the sign on the outside of the classroom that says language of the day, and the language of the day, one day would be in English, and then the following day would be in the immersion language. So in that case, similar to doing an instructional minute split, students are getting instruction in all contents in both language and are alternating. And so one of the pros of doing that type of model is there are some cases where if you do an instructional minute model, for instance, if you do have shorter blocks, or if you follow a curriculum that has 90-minute literacy lessons, then it might be difficult to split those instructional minutes in the middle. So you do want to think about this in terms of not only your goals for your students and your resources to provide the type of instruction that you want to, or to implement the type of immersion model that you want to, but also thinking about the fit of the curriculum as well. And if you're developing your own curriculum, you'll want to be cognizant of making sure that that curriculum really is aware of any type of splitting that you may have to do in terms of grade levels or instructional minutes. And then finally, we have full immersion. So full immersion describes programs where all academic content is taught through the medium of the immersion language. Students are completely surrounded by the language that is being learned. And like we said earlier, students in this model exhibit the highest levels of fluency in the immersion language. Okay, and this is our full immersion example. I do want to give the caveat that they do have some bridge programming, so that's also an option to check out if you're thinking about, I really want a full immersion school, but I want to make sure students are prepared if they go to a different type of program or an English only program. This might be a good one to check out further because they do have some bridge programming for students who might be transitioning to a different type of environment. So this is Chalagi Chuna de Kwasi, which is the Cherokee Immersion School. And it is a charter school. It is a charter school that is authorized by Cherokee Nation that serves students in grades pre-K through 8. The charter was accepted by Cherokee Nation in 2010, and it was the first Oklahoma charter school for Cherokee language immersion. The curriculum that they used was designed using Oklahoma grade level state standards, but the instruction is exclusively in Cherokee, and all print materials such as handouts, classroom anchor charts, things that their resources that students are using in their learning are all in the Sequoia syllabary, which you can see in the title of the slide. That's actually the name of the school in the proper alphabet. And so instruction in this immersion program is in medium and full immersion with a bridge program that 7th and 8th graders can participate in who are going to Sequoia High School or other public high schools that are English only. And so that bridge program is this kind of component that helps students transition between that full immersion and another school they might be going to. And then a second immersion school opened in 2022 in Stillwell, Oklahoma, as an expansion of this original program. And so if you're thinking about starting an immersion school or program and you have an existing program in the language nearby, an expansion might be an option and potential for partnership as well. So that's kind of another thing to consider as you're designing.
For the first time this year, the Cherokee Immersion School is teaching 140 students, a number that keeps going up. From ages 3 to 14, students are learning all subjects in the native language.
There's not that much fluent speakers in our language now, and most of them are passing. And I guess the Cherokee Nation just thinks that kids should learn Cherokee so they can be fluent speakers too.
Right now, the Cherokee chief is working on a plan to expand the campus, using the old casino as a new facility for the growing demand.
I think there is a hunger among our people to learn their language, learn their culture. That's true everywhere. Those who can send their children to this school, I think that's a good sign that more and more of them are doing it.
Students here are constantly learning new vocabulary, like the Cherokee translation of different kinds and different colors, which they hope to bring into conversation with future generations.
Some people may not know Cherokee when I get older, and I want my kids I want my kids to learn it.
Others are excited to have this responsibility.
Don't want it to like fall apart and stuff and people forget about it.
Currently, there are less than 2,000 fluent Cherokee speakers,
Huh?
and this school is prepared to change that. Reporting in Tahlequah. Megan Allison, 2 Works for you.
Okay, so like I said earlier, we're gonna revisit this continuum and we're gonna pop up another poll for y'all. So in kind of reflecting on some of those examples, some of the pros and cons shared, different ways of implementing these different models, now that you've had time to listen to some of those things and think through some of those things, which one do you think at this moment sounds like a best fit for you and your community? And so you should see that poll popping up on your screen. And you may still answer the same way you did at the beginning, but maybe your thoughts have changed. So we just kind of want to circle back there. All right. Thank you all so much for your participation. I see a little bit more interest around dual language, about the same amount of interest in partial immersion. So awesome. All right, so the next kind of section that we're going to cover is some different school models. So not only do you need to make some decisions around what type of immersion, how you're going to split instructional time and contents in your school, but you also want to think about which model of a school, for instance, that school within a school model that we talked about. There's also the charter school, lab school, private school. So we're going to talk about some of those models. So these are the ones that we're going to cover. There are lots of different ways to build a school, run a school. We're going to focus on these 4 types. So the school within a school model, we'll kind of circle back to that and give another example that's actually a school within a community center. And then we'll go over charter schools, lab schools, and private schools. So first we have the school within a school model. So a school within a school shares facilities and often oversight with an existing school. However, students would follow a separate education program, have their own faculty potentially, and identify with their sub-school unit. And so if you were with us for session 1, Andrea Diaz Machado's school is a school within a school model. And then some of the pros of this type of thing to sort of recap what Olani was talking about earlier. So you do have that use of existing facilities and resources. You have the use of existing operations. And one of the barriers that we've seen in some of the immersion schools or starting a new immersion school is particularly for older students, if you're thinking about how to start a secondary school, is that providing extracurriculars. Sometimes you have students who are really interested in an immersion model, but may also want to participate in some extracurriculars that you might not have the resources to provide. And so if you do use an existing school, then you can also kind of have those existing extracurriculars, maybe athletic programs, be things that your students can participate in without you having to secure additional resources or funding. And then for the cons for this model, oftentimes you do have those existing operations, that existing school structure is still going to have some type of control over kind of your operations and how you deliver instruction. And so you definitely want to make sure that the partnership, if you are going to partner with someone in this way, is the right fit. And like Andrea shared in the first session, something she's thinking through is how to remain involved in the instructional model in an ongoing way. So those are also additional structures that you might want to think through if you are thinking about sharing space. So this is an example of a similar model. Like I said, they're not in a school, they're in the Boys and Girls Club, so school within a community center. And so that's something that you might want to think about as well. So having your school within an existing facility doesn't always necessarily mean that it has to be an existing school. You can kind of think outside of the box there. So this example is a Rosebud Sioux Lakota immersion school. And they're in an immersion elementary school that has a space sharing agreement with the Boys and Girls Club of Rosebud to use their facility. And so part of their sharing agreement stipulates that the school has access to a large classroom space, a commercial grade kitchen, a large gym, a multimedia space, and a library room. And so that goes back to some of those pros that we talked about, where depending on your resources, depending on availability of facilities, you may not have the resources or the access to a facility that has all of those spaces, because, you know, in operating a school, you also have to think about the students eating and library space and kind of spaces outside of those classroom spaces. And so in a situation like this, they get to take advantage of some of those existing facilities while still running their program. Particularly if you are concerned about that con of the control over the operations and instructional model piece, thinking about how you might space share with a community organization is another way to kind of mediate that con, especially if it's a community organization that is within your community or run by your community already. In their case, this is a 2-year agreement. So this is also something that you might want to think about as potentially a temporary solution. So you may just design your program to be a school within a school for the long term, but there's also options around maybe you don't have the resources to have your own facility right now, but you might be working towards that. And so if you have something like a space sharing agreement that defines what sharing the space looks like, what facilities you have access to, what control you have, and how long that agreement is for, that can kind of give you some time as well to build out the sustainability piece.
Casey, can I share a con, particularly in the area of like school within a school and that control and that independence piece
Absolutely.
really comes into play when you're talking about assessments, and particularly if your state or your governing school structure does not have an assessment that is in the native language or in the language of instruction. And so when you're in that school within a school model, you would be, if your state does not have a native language assessment, then your students need to take the English assessment, which does not give you real like student learning data, and oftentimes can have the students feel defeated and not feel as smart, even though they are learning this whole fabulous language. And so that is one of those cons related to the idea about independence as far as assessments go.
Yeah, great point, Olani. And that reminds me of, an important consideration, even when you're talking about language type, or just something to even just be aware of. Like the Cherokee Immersion School example earlier, like I said, they do teach the Oklahoma state standards, but in Cherokee, depending on your state, right, every state is a little bit different when it comes to standardized assessments, or how that data is used, shared, things like that. I know that in the cases of states like Oklahoma, Texas, kind of those areas, we do have that data is shared, and that data is used sometimes to make decisions about state oversight of schools and things like that. And so you'll want to think about those types of things as well, because I know in the case of Oklahoma, the state assessment is in English, right? So if you are learning the content in another language, you still have to administer the standardized test in English. And so you'll have to, be prepared for those scores to potentially be low, and for those scores to be published. And so you'll have to kind of, think through that as well, and especially in terms of, communicating progress to families, communicating progress to students, communicating academic growth to potential students, right? Because some of these resources that are built out by state education agencies or local education agencies might not, include language assessments or other types of assessment that you're using. So you'll want to think through, how are you communicating academic progress to current families and potential families as well, in a way that's meaningful for the instruction you're providing them and for what your goals are.
Okay.
And so back to the Lakota Immersion School example here, we are going to watch a little video just to kind of give you a little bit of background about their particular program. They are elementary. They do share space. Their model is centered around kinship and interrelatedness, and then their instructional design is individualized and project-based, and they do have this whole family support component. So we will watch the video just to learn a little bit more about their program. Olani, I'm missing.
Tokiyechi. It's the Chunga CDC's Lakota Immersion School. Our vision is that the children will stand with everything Lakota and will be prepared to take on anything. Along with the Lakota language and cultural teachings built in the curriculum, students share space with the drum, learning songs, dance, and proper cultural etiquette as they share space together. Many Lakota cultural practices were not legal to participate in until 1978. Many of us know the stories of children not allowed to speak their native tongue in the federal and church-led boarding schools. So to walk through the halls of Wakayaja Tokiyechi, hearing children speaking Lakota or in song and witness them dance, feels like a most beautiful reclamation of who we are as Lakota people.
All right. So something you'll notice about what they shared in that video as well are some structures that they implement in their school that you might want to think through as well. So it's not just the instructional pieces, but what else can you incorporate from your language and your culture in kind of the day-to-day of what students are involved in your program. Then our next kind of school model is a charter school. And so some pros of this are a bit more degree of independence. The funding is less difficult than starting a private school. However, more fundraising may be required just depending on what the needs are and what the resources are. And then that extracurricular piece that we talked about earlier, a lot of charter schools don't have the capacity, whether it be facilities or staff, funding to offer robust extracurricular programs, particularly if you have a lot of interest among students in athletics, or if you're looking at creating a program for older students. Sometimes that can be a barrier to getting enrollment at your schools. And so a charter school is a tuition-free school that receives government funding but operates independently of the established school system of the state in which it is located. So this is something that can be helpful when we were thinking, earlier about some of those parameters that the state may set. And so you might want to consider this type of model in those situations. And also important to note that charter schools can be authorized by a variety of entities, but that can vary by state. So you will want to look into the charter school process for your particular state. That is something in terms of independence that can be helpful. So like I said, with the Cherokee example earlier, it is authorized by Cherokee Nation, which does give you that kind of community oversight and independence in that way. But there are other authorizing agencies could include tribes, local education agencies, and state education agencies. So you'll want to look into your particular state and think about what the best fit would be around the authorizing agency as well. And we have seen several examples of charter schools, so we're not going to go into another example of a charter school, but for instance, Cherokee Nation's Immersion School from earlier is considered a charter school, and then the WIO example as well. And if you're familiar with Native American Community Academy, that would be another example of a charter school. So lots of existing immersion schools are charters.
And then oh, go ahead. Were you saying something?
I was just going to say, I'm going to turn it over to Alani to talk about lab schools.
And I just took your cue. So another model is a lab school. And so a lab school is usually a school associated with a college or university and used for training of future teachers, educational experimentation, educational research, and professional development. Some of the cons are that, again, because you're connected to the university, you have a wonderful access to resources, both as far as teachers and administrators, not to mention, a lot of the curriculum materials and resources that are flowing from the university into the school, as well as being a partner for ongoing research. Again, one of the cons is, potential for less control because you are under that larger system of a university. And it may be a difficult to find a partner with the space and capacity because a lot of times they are maybe co-locating at a university site, and sometimes that might not be appropriate. So again, just around the operations, it can provide some cons. So in Hawaii, we have a laboratory school named Navahi Kalani Pu'uiki, a Hawaiian laboratory school. It is a Hawaiian immersion school, PK through 12. It is 100% immersion. It also offers a Japanese language elective, but that Japanese language is taught in Hawaiian. So both the English and Hawaiian the English and Japanese are taught through the medium of Hawaiian language. This school is an interesting school because it has a pre-K through 12 component, and the preschool is actually a private, maybe some of you know it as Ahapuna Leo. That is a private preschool. And then you have this laboratory school in sort of the middle. And then for the high school, it is actually a school within the school under both Hilo High School as well as the University of Hawaii at Hilo. But all those programs are located on the same campus. So it's a very interesting model, and they really take advantage of all the different ways to both gain access and to deal with the needs of the students as well as the family. And so when you look at the high school is connected to Hilo High School. That gives the students the ability to access sports, extracurricular activities, but they also are, because they are connected to the university, they are also automatically receiving dual credit for a variety of Hawaiian language courses that they receive through the university. But then for the idea of wanting to have control over sort of the core part of their program, they created that laboratory school and also have a charter school associated with it. And so they really do a really amazing job of taking advantage of all the different models and tools to best suit the needs of both the school as well as their students. And I'll turn it back over to you, Casey.
Thank you. So like Alani was kind of pointing out with that last example too, you don't just have to think of this in silos in terms of, you have to choose one direction. So like in that example, they kind of have approached it from a lot of different angles. And so that's something that you can consider as well. I did want to, before I move into the private school pros and cons, I did want to address one of the questions in the chat, just in case y'all did not see my answer in the chat. And so we had a question, do these programs include non-Indigenous participants? Most programs will allow non-Indigenous participants or do not state otherwise. However, in terms of like the specific examples, so just to give you an idea of some options, I know that the Cherokee Immersion School does require, because of the kind of number of seats available and the demand, they do require that prospective students are enrolled members of a tribe. So they don't have to be members of Cherokee Nation specifically to attend the school, but they do have to provide their tribal enrollment. So they do have to be enrolled in a tribe. So there are some examples that do not have non-Indigenous participants. And then Judy's question, have the examples of immersion schools written their own language and culture standards? Are parents learning alongside the students too? Judy, I'm so glad you asked, because it's like a plug for the future work that we're doing. So Olani actually is in the process of putting together a conversation around this idea of creating language and culture standards. And so we are going to have information in future podcasts and sessions, both on examples that are classroom or school level. So y'all will see those examples of how schools or teachers have worked to create language and culture standards. And then you'll also see a statewide approach to language and culture standards as well. So you'll kind of have lots of different ideas around that. So stay tuned. And then as far as parents learning alongside the students too. So in our next session, which is on curriculum and teacher training, session 3, she is going to talk about how she has expanded the curriculum to include an adult curriculum and how both teachers and parents are learning alongside students in that way. So we will definitely cover that.
And there was a previous question I answered in the chat, but around, is assessment a part in immersion schools for proficiency? Is it conversational proficiency? The priority of immersion programs?
So we will also have a session and a podcast on assessment, and language proficiency. But I will say that there are examples that are more heavily oral assessment. So like have students having conversations with one another to demonstrate proficiency, and potentially evaluating that in more of like a rubric type of manner that schools have created themselves. But there are also curriculums, for example, the kind of curriculum we'll look at next week. There are assessment examples in there that are all different types. From what I've seen, people who have created their own assessments try to include a lot more oral, conversational, and audio components, particularly for Indigenous languages, than you might see in a traditional like language arts class. But there are still, like matching, creating sentences, putting things in a sequence, translating, reading stories in the language, and having dialogue that's more, comprehension in the language. So there are lots of different types of assessments that people have kind of pulled into this space.
Yeah, and I think the additional piece around immersion assessments is that you are also measuring content knowledge as well. So whether it's math or social studies or science, you may be also having that assessment be utilized or utilizing the medium of the native language. So it's not just about language proficiency.
Absolutely. Okay. And we will have additional time for questions at the end. So if y'all think of anything else, you can throw it in the chat. If anything pops up along the way, I will answer it at the end when we get to our question slide. As far as private schools, this is kind of our last school model that we'll cover. A private school is a school supported by a private organization or private individuals rather than by the government. And so most traditional US private schools charge tuition. However, there are some tuition-free models that rely on fundraising. And so some pros of this model is one, that again, that independence, because it's supported by a private organization or private individuals, you do have a lot more freedom in terms of how you are designing and assessing your programming. If you do charge tuition, in terms of sustainability, it could provide ongoing funding. If you do not charge tuition, you will want to think about that sustainability piece. So if you are relying on fundraising, that's your fundraising strategy, your structures. Those are definitely some operational things that you'll really want to think about if you do go the route of a tuition-free private school. A couple of cons: private school does have the highest startup costs as compared to some of the other models. You will have to really think about what facilities might look like. So you might want to think about, are there existing facilities around in your community? Are there facilities that are maybe the tribes that you could work out even a space sharing agreement in this case as well, but run it like a private school? So you'll want to kind of think about those things. And then if you are a private school that charges tuition, then you have that piece of accessibility for students and equity. And this is an example of a private school. And this example, it is a successful tuition-free private school model. So they do rely on fundraising to support their school. It also is an all-girls school. So like we kind of touched on earlier, there's lots of different decisions that you can make about how you run your school, and all of those things can be woven together. And so at the Pine Ridge Girls School, like I said, donations fund the school. They do not receive any state or federal funding, and they do not charge tuition. It serves girls in grades 6 through 12, and students learn Lakota language, culture, and values through classes. My understanding of their model is it would be closer to what we would call an elective model, but it is a really good model of a tuition-free private school. And the curriculum is designed around 3 strategic areas: environmental science, leadership and governance, and then art, communication, and technology. So now that we have discussed some big decisions to think about when creating a school or a new program, we do want to give you guys some time to, y'all are asking such great questions in the chat, and so we want to give you some time to, one, network with your peers, talk story with each other, meet each other, and then also to think about these 2 questions. So what immersion type and school model are you leaning towards? And then how have your initial thoughts changed or been affirmed today? We will debrief after the breakout rooms around these 2 topics. So we hope that you will come back with some things to share. But we also do want to encourage you to network with your peers during this time as well. So we will set a 7-minute timer on our end. We will put you in some random breakout rooms, and I will throw these questions in the chat for y'all as well so that you can see them once you move. All right, before we go out to breakout rooms, do we have any questions about what we're about to do? All right, we will send you guys out to breakout rooms and set the timer.
We do have everyone back.
I don't think anyone's come back yet.
Okay.
Gave them a 60-second timer, so some people might wait till it kicks them out.
Gotcha. There we go.
Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, welcome back. Well, I hope you all had let's see, is everybody back? I'm just checking. Yeah. So I hope you all had a really great conversation in your rooms, and we really want to hear back from you about some of those conversations. I know Casey had messaged if you could designate someone in your room to just sort of share back what your conversation is about. We do have some debrief questions that you can maybe organize your thoughts around as it relates to the conversation that you had. First is really just to share and reflect. Have any of your initial thoughts regarding starting your immersion school changed, or maybe they've been affirmed? And the second real question is about identifying concepts, like what stood out to you from today's session. Also, maybe in the breakout rooms, maybe something that was shared by one of your peers really sort of resonated with you or stood out and made you go, and then the third debrief question is really apply concepts. So which immersion type and school model seems most promising for your goals? So I would love to hear from any room that want to start the sharing. Also, you can, if as an individual, you want to reflect on these thoughts and debrief, you can go ahead and also provide that in the chat. So can we hear maybe from room 1?
Hi, I'll share. I'm not sure what room we were in, Michelle, but
That's cool.
I'll share. So we kind of talked about like the capacity to become a full immersion. You know, that's like the dream, right? We all want to be fully immersed in our language and culture, but the reality of it is there aren't many fluent speakers, and you know, the whole publicizing of the curriculum and making sure everyone has access to it. Well, it's really political, you know, trying to get everyone on board, you know, tribal council, tribal ed department, all of that. And I was just sharing that we know it's sacred, right? Our language and our ways of being, our traditions, we know it's sacred, but it's becoming so sacred that no one knows it. Another challenge was that where I'm at, the Gila River Indian community, we're comprised of 2 tribes. So, you know, where do we find that balance, and making sure we're not, you know, putting one language over another, and then, you know, the dialects, things like that. But yeah, we were really looking at the partial immersion for right now, you know, that baby steps toward that full, but yeah, that's where we're at from our team.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, that actually kind of sparked a thought for me as well as you were sharing is, you know, it might even be useful to, you know, start out as a partial immersion and think through kind of how Judy was talking about earlier, you know, about like families learning alongside students or potentially, you know, teachers that maybe are strong in content but not the language, learning alongside, you know, students as well, and kind of having a simultaneous K-12 adult type of programming where you're training teachers up to then eventually become that full immersion.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I think we had one other room. I think Judy and Richard were in there. If one of y'all wants to share.
I want to piggyback on just like one thing that was already said about finding language teachers. We had that same conversation where there's one thing like finding like language teachers, but then also some of the language teachers that we find aren't always teachers too. So like something that me and Judy talked about at the beginning of the meeting was how do we measure success? How do we create curriculums? And that's not something that every language teacher has with them that they can bring into the classroom.
Right.
Me and Judy also come from like 2 very different parts, where she has like only a couple languages, and then I'm here in Clark County with a public school, so I have many languages that are desired to be learned, and only 2 local tribes from or 2 bands from the same tribe.
Wow.
But thank you guys for this meeting, because me and Judy were able to share a couple ideas though.
Awesome. That's great. Sounds like a really interesting conversation for sure. Okay. Well, thank you guys for sharing. You know, again, what you discussed in your room, as well as some of the thoughts that maybe the previous slides have spurred in your further thinking about how to create in your immersion school. And so right now, I mean, I know we've been answering questions as we've gone. If there are any other questions you have, you can come off of mute and ask, and we'll try to answer them.
One I have is with I don't know if all the schools are running into, like ours is, big hurdle is those lack of fluent speakers to be the teachers in that. So then what creative ways are they using to still have access to the language? And then if they're not able to do full immersion in that, what, how are they increasing the fluency of the youth? Well, you want it to be of the families too, but of the youth too.
I will say I just actually, Alani and I were just talking with someone who does immersion on the Fort Peck reservation this morning, and we had an interesting conversation about using like technology to kind of get around that. So potentially bringing in like existing programs at college or tribal colleges to where maybe you're pulling, some of your instruction from that, but you still have like your staff that are facilitating the learning experience, whereas you may not be necessarily the content or the language expert in that case. I know some people have done a lot of work around partnering with, like Rosetta Stone, native teaching aids, like different kind of formats, or converting a lot of the audio into things to where their curriculum is a little bit more scripted for teachers. So even if a teacher may not be comfortable pronouncing something, or, may not feel super comfortable or be fluent in the language, they can still teach it to a certain extent, especially at those foundational levels. Maybe they're a skilled foundational reading teacher, but they don't necessarily have that fluency in the language. So providing them that scripted kind of content too is another option. Did anyone else have any ideas around that? Anything that y'all are doing in your own work that you've seen be successful for supporting teachers?
I just like to include this, like, maybe this would be a question, or maybe this could be like an idea, but maybe perhaps like instead of, like say if our school comes up with, because we're in the infancy of this, we're wanting to go move forward. We're at a standstill. We want to move forward, and this past summer is the first time we've ever done anything as far as like fully implementing some kind of immersion program. And everything that the summer school staff has already put in place, all the templates they've made, and they did a lot of laminating this summer and all these things that they've done. Probably like be mindful of archiving those things or putting those things aside, or having a way so everybody doesn't have to, move 2 steps back.
Yeah.
But just continue to move forward what we can have, and keep going, I guess, because we just want to lose things that lose steps that we've already come up with.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I wanted to.
Yeah, that's important for sure. I think you really have to look
Is
at
anybody doing that or have any ideas?
Yeah, I think you really have to look at sort of where you're at and take a real hard look at, what your capacity is, particularly within the language, and not just with the language, but also the skill set, the instructional and content knowledge of your teachers, and really make sometimes it's hard decisions about where you're going to put your time and effort and resources. And, I have not yet seen immersion school program. A lot of times you are building the plane while you fly. And so, all the questions about assessment and curriculum, like teachers are like creating all of that, and they are sharing that, and they are developing the curriculum as you go. But I would really encourage you, if you can take some time to not just jump into immersion, but take the time to invest in your teachers and in your curriculum. Make sure that you're investing in their language and their content knowledge and their instructional strategies and their instructional capacity and the development of your assessments, and give them the time and space to do that while not having to be running, classes at the same time would be something very revolutionary as far as I think immersion schools go. But particularly when you don't have that many fluent speakers, it might be really good to take that time to develop that fluency skill, at least to a particular level. And then you open your school and continue to provide that professional development around language acquisition and proficiency for your teachers.
Yeah, I will say kind of two things. So, one, our session next week, she will talk about, she has kind of a repository. So to what y'all were kind of saying, they have those resources both in print, but also in a digital format where you can kind of ongoing access those materials and things in a way where, they don't have to be recreated or, made again. It's just already there by lesson. So they're in order to where you can find them. So things like videos, audio files, activities, those types of things, stories that have been translated from English into the language, origin stories, like all those kind of different things are in that repository. And then to Alani's point, I do think, if y'all are in general, if anyone's kind of in the stages where you're really in those planning and development stages, or you're thinking about an immersion school, I think sometimes we have to take a few steps back and really evaluate how we are fostering fluency at an adult level as well. And so sometimes the first step to starting an immersion school might actually be developing adult programming to ensure that you do have the speakers and you do have the like teachers. So it might be even starting out really thinking about what partnerships you can form to create a pipeline of teachers that have both content and language knowledge. It could be, thinking about how you can partner at like the tribal government level in terms of offering, classes to adults, or how you can involve families so that they're reinforcing the language at home. Like kind of have to think outside of the box. And then as much as possible, if in terms of funding and resources, if you're able to kind of step back and say, okay, before I open the school, I'm going to use some of my funding and resources to really fund like building curriculum and things before the doors open. Because a lot of times, like Alani said, we kind of we open and then we're like, all right, let's make this curriculum, let's design these assessments, but really thinking through doing that ahead of time so that you can provide teachers with that support on the front end. So we do have just a few minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and kind of close this out. I do want to draw y'all's attention to two things. So once you and your core team have engaged your community and made some of these foundational decisions like we've discussed in this session, really a great next step after that point is to conduct your first readiness assessment. And that kind of gets at some of these challenges and things that we've been discussing as well. And so to learn more about conducting a readiness assessment, we invite you to check out our first blog post, which will be up after this session, along with the recording of this session. And then within that blog post, you will see this tool will be linked, and then it will also be available under tools on the webpage. And Olani put that link to the webpage in the chat. So if you will check back there tomorrow, we'll have the recording for this, as well as the blog and this tool. And so the readiness assessment, I will really, if you read the blog, it'll give you some more in-depth information, but the readiness assessment really captures some ideas that are used in determining a community's ability or readiness to address an issue, to start a new program. It's oftentimes used for thinking about starting charter schools and things like that. And so we've created a readiness assessment that really is tailored to immersion schools, because that's something that we've discussed is like there's a lot of these ideas floating around in kind of the charter school world, but a lot of these tools are not tailored to our communities. And so if you read into this, it will guide you through assessing where you are at in terms of resources and readiness in both some internal areas and some external areas. And so that would be a good place to start and think about, where do you really need to focus your attention? It might be you need to build some partnerships. You might need to think outside of the box in terms of some programming, maybe on resources and funding, personnel. So it'll guide you through each of those areas. So we invite you to check those two things out. And then coming up, our first podcast episode will be available in the same place very soon. And then we have a couple of other podcasts that will be coming out shortly as well. And our next live webinar is next Thursday at 3 p.m. on curriculum and teacher training. And next Thursday session will be with Dr. Crystal Redgrave, who is Assiniboine. And please stay in touch if you're interested in submitting resources to help build a kind of repository. If you want to sign up for the newsletter. So we invite you to stay in touch with us, follow us on Twitter, and we hope to see you next week.